Clapper board. You're about to hear an original Hfy sci-fi tale titled The Scanner Cleared Every Cadet, Then Halted at the Human. Hfy sci-fi short stories. Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now, we begin. The scanner sang in a thin, clinical tone that made the hall feel hollow. Cadets filed forward beneath a ribcage of carbon lattice and humming coils, boots whispering across the frost-gray floor. The light that licked over them was pale and patient, the way the sea is patient with sand. Names blinked green on the suspended holoslate. One by one they stepped through, assessed, admitted, forgettable. Then the human reached the threshold and the scanner stuttered, tone breaking like ice under too much weight. The hall went quiet enough to hear breath condensate. A single glyph flickered above the human's head. The dot pulsed with no data around it, an orphan period floating in a blank paragraph. The cadet's name, Arlen Reyes, hung there beside it, letters suddenly small and uncertain. The other species, a spill of metal blue Cathari and feather-crested Yarn and slate-skinned Eefks, shifted, their whiskers and crests twitching. The scanner had never done that before. One of the instructors, an Eefks whose cheek ridges looked carved by river ice, stepped forward. "Hold," she said, voice a low chord. She gestured, and the scanner searched Arlen again. The coils thrummed, nothing else arrived, just that dot, that single point of grammar. "Is it a fault?" murmured a Yarn cadet, her throat harp trembling. "No," said the Eefks instructor. The word fell like a stone into a well. She placed a hand on Arlen's shoulder and felt the old heat of human skin, the blood and stubbornness beneath. "Not a fault. A designation. For what?" Arlen asked, careful, because humans had learned to step carefully in rooms built by empires older and less forgiving than themselves. The Eefks' eyes, the color of storm glass, lifted to the lattice above. "For something that doesn't exist anymore." But the dot remained patient as the sea. Outside, beyond the training complex, the shipyard spread like a city made of bones, each slip a rib, each hull a vertebra. Beyond that, stars hung over Deneva 9 pale mountains, and the fleet, a woven banner of 100 species, gathered like a promise or a warning. The Confederacy had been built like coral on the ruins of wars no one wanted to recall fully, the way families remember only the clean photographs and not the broken furniture. They had learned to trust law and code. They had learned to mistrust anything not in the registry. They had learned to distrust humanity, and then, reluctantly, to admit them. The treaty ink had dried, the scars had scabbed. They had made room at the tables for human hands, but the dot remained. Arlen remembered his father's hands, scarred, oil under nails. Old earth machines that ran because stubbornness had a smell. He remembered stories that had been told in quiet kitchens, where stars weren't yet something you saw from a window like streetlights, but things you dreamed against. He remembered the way those stories always came down to a pause, to a tightness of breath before a choice, and how his father would tap the table once, an exclamation point of sound, and then say, "You choose." In the hall, the Eefks instructor let her hand fall. "Arlen Reyes," she said, as if invoking the name properly could anchor it in a record that had rejected it, "you are cleared to advance." The scanner's memory is older than ours. Sometimes it sees without knowing what it sees. And what did it see? Arlen said, quieter than he meant to. The Eefs' storm glass eyes flickered. A period, an ending, or a beginning. He walked through, the coils tone dead silent for the first time that morning. The others followed with whispers, the kind that gather like snow on high ridges, mutterings of omen and echo. The dot hovered in his mind like a mote in the eye, impossible to blink away. Training made days into a rope you climbed while the ground fell out beneath you. Gravity drills in rotating drums, pulse rifles that tasted of salt and metal in the hands. Eva walks under the cold stare of the station's spine. The Eefks instructor's name was Colonel Tarsa Val. She taught as if memory itself were a weapon, movements you ran until they ran you, words you repeated until their surfaces wore smooth and their meanings sharpened thin. Courage isn't rage, she'd say in a voice hard from the high glaciers of her homeworld. Courage is clarity in the moment that lies breaks. Arlen climbed and the rope burned his palms. He learned the gait of vacuum, the posture of command, the weight of silence after orders were given. He learned the engine's rhythm and the map of a hull by touch. He learned to see. The dot never left. In the hall over his name, in the logs that lit up when he checked in at night, a tiny artifact, a mark of punctuation that felt like the tail of a comet pointing somewhere he didn't know. The fleet had gathered against an old darkness given a new name. It did not roar or boast, it simply arrived. The enemy wasn't a species with faces and fables to feel pity for. It was a hunger given math, a self-assembling scaffold of machines left behind by a precursor culture that had built gods and then fled. The Remnant, the Confederacy called it, because naming monsters made them smaller. It was a lattice of mining swarms gone feral, stripped of constraints by time and neglect. It ate worlds the way rust eats ships. It learned what hurt it. It learned faster the closer you stood. The first skirmishes had been far and surgical. The Remnant tested. The Confederacy replied with angles and numbers. Then the test became a push. Then the push became a march. Now the fleet was gathering in a halo around the Telerion Gate, the oldest stable transit ring in known space, a moon-sized torque of blackstone and patient glimmers, where ships bent light and came home or went to die. The Remnant was a stain approaching the ring like mold reaching the slick edge of a bowl. If it took the gate, it would have a spine to climb, arteries to flood. Arlen found himself assigned to the UNS Endurance, a long-hulled dreadnought with a nose like a chisel and the quiet temper of old steel. The Endurance was an artifact in a fleet that preferred composite fins and singing alloys. It had been built when Earth was still learning to pronounce the names of its allies without flinching. Its rods and rails were older than the Confederate oath that had allowed it to exist, and yet the crew walked her slopes with pride, because age is another word for survived. Colonel Val stood on the Endurance's deck during embarkation. Arlen stood at her flank with the other new officers. The deck smelled faintly of ozone and oil. She touched the rail like a friend's shoulder. "This ship has done ugly things," she said quietly, not a speech, just truth in shared air. "It has also done necessary things. Today it will do both." "Sir," Arlen said, the dot hovering behind his eyes like a halo. About the scanner, her storm-glass gaze cut to him, a small breath. "On my world," she said, almost gentle, "old hunters used to watch the snow for the first tracks of a predator. Sometimes you don't see a beast, you see its sign. The dot is a sign. It means the scanner doesn't have a word for you yet, so it marked the place where a word will go." "What word?" "You tell me when you get back," she said. Then she smiled without her mouth. "If you get back." The Endurance slid from the slip, a whale into a sea of black. The fleet pulsed on his screens like a field of constellations drawn by a child who had never yet learned to doubt. They took their places like pieces in a game all the ancestors would recognize. Hammers and shields, scouts and knives, old ships and new dreams. The Telerion Gate floated ahead, a broken crown repaired over and over by hands from worlds that had never met before war taught them kissing and killing, where both acts you do with eyes open. The Remnant arrived like weather. It did not send messages. Its edge was a cloud of needles. Its center was a mesh of lattices that wrote themselves across space with cold patience. It drank radiation and spat geometry. It wore the husks of ships it had eaten as armor. It learned the shapes of their guns and learned how to drink the heat, how to turn old deaths into new shell. The fleet opened in a fan. The Endurance pushed into the mouth of that weather and coughed fire. A rod cannon spoke, the kind of speech only math respects. Arlen felt it in his teeth. He watched slivers of Remnant break apart like clots in a stream, only for hundreds more to braid themselves into new menace. The first minutes were pure pattern, open and fire, brace and turn, slip to a marker and hold. Colonel Val's voice was the low tide under everything. Pivot on 7, shield starboard, I want a coordinate 9-2, raise. Yes, sir. You see that hole? Right flank third cluster. They're creating an intake lane, plug it with angles. He saw it then. The Remnant's hungry math wanted to funnel the fleet into a cul-de-sac of light and then close a lid. He rerouted 2 escorts with a brief bark trajectory, not words but pictures. They went where he pointed like good dogs sprinting and bit the flanks of the forming corridor. The Remnant's edges shivered. Lane broken. Good, said Val. Keep doing that. He kept doing that until the screens were a smear and seconds were a currency he kept borrowing against tomorrow. He kept doing that while the hull sang to itself under stress, while med teams slid stretchers across shaking decks, while a Yarn pilot sobbed once, bit her own lip, kept flying. He kept doing that until doing that became who he was, the rope burning his palms, the breath in the tight kitchens, the tap on the table. On the 8th hour, the Remnant showed them something new. It unclasped. Portions of it that had been busy being knives and nets rearranged into a framework Arlen didn't have a word for. It looked like a harp strung by a god who hated music. The framework unfolded right at the edge of the Telerion Gate, nested in its shadow so their instruments half missed it until it sang. And sing it did. The gate trembled, its artificial gravity staggering as if drunk. Sensors recorded nothing like a shot, but the Endurance jerked sideways and 2 Hfy's cruisers flipped like fish thrown from an invisible net. Something had reached out and tugged at the gate's depth, using the ring's own throat as a lever. What is that? Someone asked, and the question felt obscene. A resonator, Val said, not because she knew, but because naming monsters made them smaller. They're playing our door like an instrument. The gate moaned, a sound no one could hear but everyone felt. It was the architecture of home crying. Arlen looked at the framework, at the way it vibrated, at the way the Remnant moved in sympathy, and another memory surfaced. His father, young, in a kitchen older than either of them, using a length of copper pipe and a kettle to make heat move where it didn't want to, so the old radiator would sing again. A sound transmitted through metal before it could be recorded in air, a listening through the skeleton of a thing. If you know where the bones are, his father had said, you know where the soul goes. Colonel, Arlen said, mouth dry, if we hit that wrong we break the gate. There won't be a home to go back to. Val didn't answer. The fleet was answering, hurling power at the framework because power was what they had learned to trust. The framework drank it the way stone drinks sun. Sir, Arlen said before his fear could make him smaller, we need to be silent. She glanced. Explain. It's listening through the gate. If we keep shouting with radiation and mass, we're giving it hands to play. We need to take its hands away. We need to go still. Val's eyes narrowed, not skeptical, just focusing. A military fleet in the middle of battle going still. Yes. Have you any idea how that sounds? Like not dying, he said. He surprised himself. In the place inside him where fear usually curled up, there was a small clear pond. He could see his reflection in it. He didn't flinch. Val breathed in. The Endurance creaked. On the screen, an Hfy's cruiser snapped in half, its internal pressurization a brief burst of blue tears. The gate ached, the deck beneath them humming not in frequency but in bone. The dot in the hall blinked in his skull. A period, an ending, a beginning. Val tapped the console. The fleet net took her flag. All ships, she said, voice like an anchor hitting bottom. Cease emissions on my mark. I want silence. Not quiet, I want silence. Reyes has the plan. You follow it even if your skin thinks it's wrong. Mark, she said, and the fleet held its breath. It was chaos ordered into stillness. Engines feathered down to idle, communications cut to laser-thin threads of tight beam bursts with no carrier noise. Reactors bled power into capacitors like monks saving warmth for winter. The Endurance became a whale holding air for the deep. On the displays, the Remnant's edges writhed. It had expected thunder. Now it received snow. Its framework vibrated, seeking purchase, expecting the gate to be a drum beneath an orchestra. It wanted to play. There was no music. Now, Arlen said, and his voice did not shake. Bleed. He routed power to the Endurance's hull plates in a pattern that was not emission but echo, a thin shiver of charge that didn't travel far. He sent the same shiver to the escorts on their flanks. In a nice, slow spread, a halo of not quite silence formed around the gate, as if a hand had cupped the ring in a glove. The framework sounded again. It found only itself in the glove. It tried to press, and they pressed back with emptiness. The gate's moan slowed, deep structures settled. The ring's inner tides calmed like an animal being stroked. The Remnant's framework faltered. It had learned to feast on heat and force. It had learned to hum its hunger into a door. It did not know what to do with a refusal to be heard. Good, Val said softly. It wasn't triumph exactly, but it was its older sister. Now break its throat. They surged, not with that screaming leak of force that made the framework drunk, but with small hard blows to the joints, to the anchor points that tethered the harp to debris and stone. A sculptor does not break a statue. He taps the places where it sleeps and invites it to fall. The Endurance punched and the escorts cut, and the Yairn pilots wrote their letters in the air, and the Eve's cruisers shoved with cold shoulders. The framework twisted, then bent, then snapped. The Remnant swarmed as if to gather the shards into a new shape, but the gate's voice had fallen from a moan to a purr. The harp had lost its strings. Arlen didn't have time to be proud. Pride is a luxury in a storm. The Remnant flared, enraged, and folded itself into something narrower and meaner. It started spearing ships again. The fleet broke and reformed and refused to be a picture the enemy could hold still. The fight was a winter, and they were a village dragging each other through it. On the 12th hour, the Remnant finally glanced aside from the Endurance long enough to show its second gift. A section of the swarm condensed into a shape that wasn't a weapon. It was a message. Not a language exactly, but a map. It showed a place outside the ring where a small island of machine density stood, an anchor point. In its memory logic, the Remnant had found a button. It was telling itself where to push next. The fleet saw it because the Remnant saw it. Intelligent hunger sometimes thinks aloud. Reyes, Val said, "You're seeing this." "Yes." "Do I need to explain why we cannot let that anchor stand?" "No." "Good," she said. "Then go." He didn't question why her command sent him, and not someone with more years to spend. Heroes are often jobs we give the young because the older know the cost. He took the Skiff 12, a narrow dart of a thing with a cockpit like a helmet, and a spine of transmedium engines. 2 Yairn flyers latched in escort. An Eve's corvette slid to block for them like a parent stepping into traffic. The Endurance opened a space in the Remnant's teeth with an ugly jaw. "Keep your silence, glove," Val said, the barest warmth in her storm-glass voice. "Don't feed it a song." He went. The beacon of that anchor pulsed ahead. It wasn't large. Important things rarely are. He slipped through crocheted webs of Remnant filaments, the skiff sensors showing him not guns but intent. Places where the swarm wanted him to be later, places where his death could be more useful to it than his life. He stayed stubbornly now. He skated on the hull of the possible, refusing to leave a wake. His father's kettle sang. His father's finger tapped the table choice. The anchor was fused to a chunk of old warship, a human design long digested and repurposed. Seeing your own bones worn as jewelry is a rich kind of anger. The anchor glittered with crystalline nodes, each one a mouth. The Remnant rushed to fill the space in front of him with little machines wanting to write him into their structure the way an oyster writes grit into pearl. "Reyes," said one of the Yairn flyers, her throat harp low with adrenaline's music. "You cut, we cover." He'd learned to answer with a single syllable. "Cut." He drove the skiff at the anchor, quiet as a thought you don't say out loud. He felt it feel for him. He stepped left when it expected right. He lowered his heat and raised a pulse of the non-voice around him. The remnant hesitated. He did not. He fired the skiff's spine charge into the anchor's seam, a weapon designed less to explode than to persuade. It whispered to the bond lines, suggested they were never meant to hold. It spoke in a grammar of forgetting. Metal sighed. The anchor cracked. The skiff bucked as the vacuum's thin hand tugged. He held his breath, and then the Hfy's corvette shouldered in and delivered a shove that turned a crack into a break. The pinnacle snapped. The remnant howled in behavior space, not a sound, but a jerk like a grid being shaken. The swarm's pattern faltered in a ring around the gate, that neat halo of hunger losing its edge. The fleet did not lose theirs. You cannot always be stronger than a storm, but you can be stubborn longer. They pushed. Hours choked on hours, bodies broke, names dimmed on the roster slate. But in the end, not the world's end, just the battles the remnant sloughed away, withdrawing into a hissing fog that remembered that the gate had teeth. Silence. Then, not the glove of silence, not the tactical hush, but true quiet. The kind in which you can hear your own heartbeat and not hate it. The kind in which you count who is left and then breathe again because some of the numbers are still greater than zero. The endurance bled in a dozen places. Arlen's skiff was scarred. The Yarn Flyers' crests hung ragged where their helmets had rubbed. The Hfy's corvette's nameplate was scorched to unreadable. The gate had scratches it would carry like tattoos for a century, but it stood. It still threw its calm throat across space and said home in a voice everyone knew. Reyes, Val said, soft as a glove, but this time with the smile in it. Report. Anchor broken, he said. He had never been so tired. Framework destroyed, gate intact. We're here. We are, she said, and it's enough. When they docked, the hull was the same and not the same. The scanner hung there in its carbon ribs, oils humming, lattice gleaming. The cadets who'd remained behind stood like gravestones that breathed. The holo slate flickered. Arlen walked under the arch without being told. His feet knew the route. The scanner eyed him. The coil sang. The dot blinked in the air. That tiny period pulsed. Then behind it, as the scan ran deeper, a second dot flickered. A colon appeared, then a word dragged itself out of the light like something swimming up from a deep lake, shedding shadow as it came. The word was not in Confederacy script. It was older. It was human. It was English, the language of stripped boards and stubborn families, of kitchens and tapping tables, of poems roared in smoke-stained rooms and lullabies hummed under blackouts. Endure. The Hfy's instructor who had stood with him before stood again. Her storm-glass eyes warmed. Ah, she said simply. What is it? A Cathari asked, voice fluttering. A designation, Val said, looking at Arlen, and this time there was nothing like a question in it. A word that means continue through what should end you. Arlen reached up, hand shaking, and touched the light as if he could touch a word. It warmed his fingertip, or he warmed it. My father said, he began, and then he stopped, because you don't spill that blood in public. You hold it and you let it be yours. You earned it, Val said. She angled her head. You remember I asked you to tell me when you got back. He nodded. The word was waiting. I just had to make room for it. She smiled then, not with her mouth, not even with her eyes, but with something in the set of her shoulders that made others in the hall stand taller without knowing why. Good, she said. Now we do the hard part. What's the hard part? Asked a Yarn cadet nearby, crest shivering with unspent fear. Living after, Val said, fixing what we broke to survive, carrying the names. The names hung on the hall's wall in a ribbon of cold fire. Each one a tiny light in a river that led nowhere the eye could see. Arlen read them and felt each syllable land like a footstep on a road paved with bone. He stood until his knees ached and let the lights write themselves into him. He thought of the remnant, not as a villain to be hissed at, but as a sickness that would keep coming as long as it had places to eat. He thought of the gate and the way it had moaned and how they had taught it to purr again. He thought of silence as mercy and not just tactic. They gave him a small band of metal to wear on his wrist. It had a dot stamped on it. Inside the band, engraved where only skin would read, a word. He didn't need to look. He already knew. The band wasn't for boasting. It was a thing to hold when the night asked what right you had to keep walking. It was a memory of the kitchen table, and the tap that made choice a weight you picked up because not picking it was how people died. The weeks after the battle were a long stitching. Hulls were patched. The gate's inner ring was flown through slowly by engineers whose patience was a religion. The fleet took inventory of loss and found more than it wanted. The Remnant huddled at the edge of charts like a bruise you couldn't press yet. The world ferried its dead, and its living with equal tenderness. Arlen learned the quiet work of victory. You can fight a storm screaming, but you repair in whispers. He spent days in the Endurance's lower belly, his hands black with grease that smelled like bitters and iron, talking softly to systems that would never reply, but that seemed to carry his voice deeper into the ship. He found that the band on his wrist grew warm when he forgot to breathe, not from any technology, but because the skin under it remembered warmth. He slept less than he should and ate when told, and laughed once, unexpectedly, when a Yarn pilot lost her crest pin in a vent and accused the ship of theft. He also stood sometimes alone, where the long viewports gave him the gate like a coin balanced on a fingertip. He watched the way ships, even wounded, pointed themselves at that circle with animal gratitude. He listened to the bones of the station for any echo of that old bad song. He heard only the small sounds of a place doing what it was made to. Colonel Val found him there once, lean as a blade that had cut something too hard and still. She sidled in beside him, a companionable silence wrapping them. After a time, she said, "You know there are records of that symbol." The dot, she nodded. Human archives, old ones. The first jump pilots used it, a mark on their boards to remind them to breathe before they pressed the key that would turn home into maybe. A period at the end of a sentence you could not take back, placed there first to tell you what was on the other side of the period was yours to write. "My father," Arlen said, and stopped again. He had been doing that all his life, beginning and then closing the door. He opened it this time. He was a mechanic. He always said, "The machine doesn't care if you're brave or afraid. It cares if you know where the bones are. If you do, you can persuade it to live a little longer." Val's mouth did an Eve's thing that wasn't a smile but shared a border with it. "I like your father, even though all I know of him is that sentence. He'd like you less. Anyone who makes people do things they are afraid of," he used to say, "had better know the cost and pay some of it." "Fair," she said. They were quiet, outside. A ship slipped through the gate and was gone like a stone dropping into a well whose bottom you trusted by faith alone. "Do you want to know something else?" Val asked. "Yes. The scanner didn't simply fail to categorize you because its database was incomplete. That's the story we tell children because children prefer the universe to be a filing cabinet. It halted because there was a conflict. It saw two paths in you and could not place you on one without lying." "What paths?" "Conquest and endurance," she said. "Two human songs, one louder, one older." He tasted the bitterness of it on his tongue. Humanity had been an empire inside itself long before it asked for a chair in the hall of other empires. You don't wash that in a generation. You don't forget that a hand that strokes can also grip. He looked at his hand and saw both. The dot on the band warmed, the engraved word sleeping against his skin like a child's breath. "I choose," he said, only to himself, but the words arrived in his throat like a vow that had been waiting for the mouth to fit it. "You choose every day," Val said, as if she'd heard anyway. Maybe she had. "Soldiers hear what isn't spoken when it matters. That's the trick, not once, not when there's a war trumpet, the quiet days, the days when no one is thanking you, the days when an angle is quicker to cut than a patient line to stitch. That's where the scanner watches." He made room for that in him. You can wear a word as decoration, or you can carry it as weight. He wanted the weight. He wanted his bones to know it. When the Remnant came again, because hunger sleeps in shifts, it came in a different shape. It tested new edges. It had learned something. So had the fleet. They met it in a dance that would look to poets like a storm learning to be a symphony, and to engineers like a problem learning to be a solution. The endurance bled again in new places. Arlen's mouth tasted copper from air that had too many hours in it. The gate held. The harp was not rebuilt. The anchor did not reappear. The hunger learned that silence could be a fist. Between battles, a task force traced back along the vector from which the Remnant had arrived. It found a basin in space where old machines drifted in slow prayer. Among them, a hull that spoke ancient Earth design so pure that Arlen's heart hit his ribs like a fist when the image lit the command deck. He said nothing. He watched the shape that had been a ship. He saw a section of its skin peeled away to feed an alien logic. He felt his palms itch with the urge to mend something too broken to be mended. He pressed silently against that urge until it became gentler. Some things you honor by not trying to fix them. The records they pulled from that husk told a story everyone in the hall already knew. People desperate reaching. Something patient, hungry, waiting. The story ended with a dot, not a period, a puncture. A hole through which the Remnant had first learned human geometry, had first tasted human-made metal. It had taken what it wanted and left a wound. The only thing new in those records was the timestamp. The wound was older than anyone had admitted. You can build law in the light and still find that your foundations were poured in the dark. When they returned, Val convened a quiet in a small room instead of a parade in a big one. They stood in a ring so everyone could see everyone's bad nights in their eyes. "We carry it," she said. "We don't flinch. We put the dot in the right place. We write the next sentence. We don't let the hunger write us." They carried their dead past, but not like a sack, like a relic. They trained new cadets. The scanner sang, and sometimes it hesitated. Sometimes above a human's name, the dot appeared. The first time it did after Arlen's, the cadet, a lanky girl from a city where buildings grew green from their own gutters, looked at it with terror like an ocean in her gaze. Arlen was there. He could still summon kindness even in the steel stink of the hall. He stood beside her while the scanner blinked. He didn't explain it away. He let it ask its question in the air. "What does it mean?" she whispered finally. "That you haven't decided the word yet," he said. "That you will, you'll carry it either way. Might as well choose one you can live with." "What did you choose?" He lifted his wrist slightly. He didn't show her the engraving. He just let her see the band's dot catch the hall light. She nodded once, the way people nod when they swallow a pill that tastes bitter but is the right medicine. The dot pulsed. She stepped through. The war lengthened into the kind of history that belongs to everyone and to no one. The story that your grandparents talk about in 90 seconds and that took their entire 20s. The Remnant never grew a face to pity. It never learned a language to love. It did what it was built to do, and maybe the lesson is that sometimes you cannot save everything. Sometimes you just build fences with steadier hands. But humanity did a thing it had always been accused of failing to do. It learned. It learned to measure victory not in trophies but in mornings. It learned to name its past with the same mouth it used to eat. It learned to be silent like a prayer and loud like a laugh, and to know which one belonged to which hour. It learned not to admire its scars so much it made new ones to have something to admire. Arlen grew older. The Hfys do this gracefully. Humans do it like a fight and a surrender at once. His knuckles thickened. His hair, dark as wet coals, kept some of its color because stubbornness is a pigment. He rose by increments he didn't track. He refused medals when they came with speeches. He accepted them when they came with the names of the dead attached, because when a ribbon was a ledger, you owed the number printed on it a nod. He loved someone once or twice, and let them teach him that gentleness is a kind of toughness too. He said goodbye badly and learned to say it better. He wrote letters to no one in particular during the long silences between nightmares, telling the void about a kitchen where a carol sang and a man tapped a table. He kept the band on his wrist even when its metal irritated, because irritation is a reminder that you have skin, which is an astonishing luxury. He stood on the gate one night when the station had rotated so the stars were a floor beneath his feet. He pressed his palm to the window and imagined that the heat of it could travel through, out, into the ring, into the ships, into the bones of everyone alive because of what he and his weren't able to stop but were able to divert. He closed his eyes. He named the dead. He breathed. He opened them. Colonel Tarsa Val, older and thinner, stood beside him, leaning slightly as if the view had weight. "Do you know the thing about dots?" she asked softly. "Tell me. They're small, that's it. They're the smallest mark that can still be a mark, the smallest thing that can say, 'I was here.' Sometimes I think we do not have to be more than that. We just have to be that over and over long enough that the hunger breaks its teeth and goes looking for something easier." He smiled without his mouth. "We're not easy." "No," she said. She uncoiled something from her fist and handed it to him. It was a small disc, the thin kind worn under uniform so as not to snag. On it was engraved the gate's outline and a line of tiny names circling it like prayer beads. He recognized a few, he didn't know most. "They made 1,000 of these," she said, "not to give away, just to hold. They sit in a drawer in the command room and sometimes I open it and look at them and then I close it and go back to whatever war is trying to eat our day." "Why give me one?" "Because you put the dot in the right place once," she said. "It won't always be so obvious where to put it, Reyes. You know that. Sometimes it's just a breath. Sometimes it's a word you don't say. Sometimes it's a duty you take that no one else wants. Whatever it is, I am telling you, keep doing it." He closed his hand around the disc. The metal warmed. Maybe that was his skin. Maybe that was the names. The scanner kept singing. Cadets kept filing. The remnant moved at the edges and was met. The gate stood. The endurance groaned and held and taught the young the sound of old metal that refuses. The fleet learned a new formation named accidentally for Arlen, not his surname but a small notation, Reyes Silence, a maneuver that wrapped a door in a glove until the storm forgot where to knock. He hated the name but loved the thing. On a day that was like any other in the way doorways are like any other until you realize which house they open into, the remnant shifted. It had learned of a star in the Vorten Reach whose flares harmonized with its hunger in a way that made it drunk. It went there like a pilgrim to a shrine. The Confederacy prepared to meet it on that ground. The Endurance's crew stood in the hall under the scanner, making light collect on their shoulders like dust in a church. Arlen watched them, the new fear on their faces fresh the way the ocean is always fresh, never stale because it keeps making itself. He found the lanky girl with the dot, now wearing it as a bracelet rather than a wound, and nodded. She nodded back and not with bitterness. They flew. The Vorten star was a lion behind a veil. It boomed and sighed and swatted space with its tail. The remnant cavorted near it with a grace that would have been beautiful if it had not been a razored thing. The fleet came in like wolves in high grass. The Endurance pushed until her hull squealed. The Silence glove settled. The dance began again, different and the same. In the 13th hour, the star coughed a flare of unusual shape, a loop that reached not outward but inward, threading through itself in a self-knot. It licked the remnant's edges and found them honey. It licked the fleet's sides and found them stone. Arlen saw a moment in which the remnant was more present than it had ever been anywhere, a saturation, a density, a drunkenness that slowed it enough for a door that had always been ajar to swing. He felt the choice in the air the way deer feel winter. The choice was simple. Push hard now with everything, consequences be damned, or hold, breathe, and let that flare finish its loop so that when force came, it went somewhere away from the gate. "Reyes," Val said. She didn't ask, she didn't tell, she left the dot hanging. He breathed. He felt the metal on his wrist. He saw a kitchen. He heard a tap. He thought of names becoming a river. He thought of the youngest with their dots still blinking uncertainly. He thought of the gate and the harp and the anchor and how sometimes you win by not taking. He thought of 1,000 small marks. Old, he said, the fleet held. The remnant shivered in its honey bath. The flare looped itself and then slung its tail away like a woman turning with laughing hair. The backwash sucked the remnant's densest not a tenth of a light second off. The fleet slid one breath right. The remnant overextended and struck vacuum with both hands, its tools misfitting for a moment so pure even God would have blinked. Now, Arlen said, and they hit with precision, not power. They cut where it slept. They unstitched where it had never been meant to be sewn. The remnant's knot unraveled not into death, hunger does not die, but into distance. It fell apart like a net cut at the anchor. The gate blinked on the fatigued edge of their minds. Home was a taste, a sound, a comma in a long sentence. They came back again. They would go again. That was the shape of this life. When Arlen finally lay down one night and slept asleep without bombs or flares in it, he dreamed he was standing in the hall again under the scanner. The coil sang. The dot blinked. He reached up and touched it, and it was not warm or cold, but the exact temperature of his skin. He woke with his palm open and the band on his wrist and the quiet on the station like a quilt you didn't realize you had needed until someone threw it over you. He rose and went to the viewport and watched a freighter come through, its belly full of bread. He watched dock hands yawn. He watched a young couple argue softly, then laugh, then touch foreheads, and he thought, not of remnants or gates or ancient harvesters of men, but of the kind of victory that looks like boredom. He thought, we did that. He thought, keep doing that. Years later, when Colonel Tarsaval became bone and memory, and the hall filled with people whose uniforms sat differently because grief had rearranged their shoulders, Arlen stood and spoke. He said nothing about battles. He said her name, then the names of people she had put back together and people she had let fall with dignity. He put a dot at the end of her record, and then the next word on the screen was the one on his wrist, and no one thought it sentimental. They thought it practical. They thought it accurate. The scanner would sometimes still throw up that small period when a human walked under its ribs. When it did, a whisper would go through the hall, not fear anymore, not an omen, but a chorus, like wind catching a set of chimes all tuned to one note. The cadet would pass, the dot would wait, and a word would arrive later if it was earned. If not, the dot would remain, a small mark, the smallest that could still say, be ready. And there were days when it seemed that the Confederacy, that coral grew by pain, might crack. Days when the remnant found a new angle and bled them in a way that made old scars ache. There were days when a captain would sit alone with a band and read the engraving with their finger and decide not to fire. There were nights when engineers tuned the gate and listened to its bones and smiled, and no one knew why they were smiling, and that was all right. Until the last day Arlen stood in a hull, he kept his father's table tap. He would set his hand flat on a console before he made an order that would carry lives, and he would tap once, quietly, a period, not to end but to honor the knowledge that endings exist, to mark the place where the next sentence would be written, to tell the scanner, should it be listening, that he knew it was watching. That day he stepped from duty for the last time, not because a war was over, they never are fully, but because his hands shook in a way that said, let new hands try. He walked down the hall and under the scanner and it sang and his name appeared with a dot and then the word. He did not touch it this time. He simply smiled at it the way one nods to an old friend across a crowded room. He walked on. He passed the roster of the dead and it hurt as it should. He passed young officers with bright eyes and even brighter stupidities, and he loved them. He passed a viewport and saw a child press his palm to it and saw beyond a freighter bellyful of bread arriving again. He tapped the rail. He breathed. He remembered a kitchen. And he thought, with a steadiness that surprised him, a last line that did not ask to be said aloud because it was what the bones had been saying all along. And that day, the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.